What does it mean to become one with a machine designed to kill? When you spend months behind a weapon so powerful that a single squeeze of the trigger can cut a man in half, when you learn every contour and mechanism so intimately that operation becomes instinct, when you depend on that steel and gunpowder more than you depend on anything else in the world, what happens to the line between man and machine? Can you love something that exists only to destroy? Can you hate something that saves your life and the lives of your brothers again and again? What weight does a weapon carry beyond its 84 pounds of steel and springs and precision engineering? I'm asking these questions because I lived with those contradictions for 11 months of combat in Europe, because I was a machine gunner with the M2 Browning, 50 caliber heavy machine gun, the weapon we called Ma Deuce. And because that relationship with that particular piece of equipment changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand 80 years later. This is the story of how I learned to master the deadliest infantry weapon in the American arsenal, and how that mastery cost me pieces of my soul I'll never get back. My name is Vincent Samuel Caruso, and I was a private first class in the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, assigned as a 50 caliber gunner on an M3 half-track. I was 20 years old when I landed in Normandy on June 8, 1944, 2 days after D-Day, a skinny Italian kid from the Bronx who'd never fired anything more powerful than a .22 rifle before the Army got hold of me. I'd been trained as a driver initially, but drivers were plentiful and machine gunners were in short supply after the initial landings took heavy casualties. So 2 days before we shipped out from England, I was reassigned to be the 50 cal gunner on half-track Charlie 7, part of a mechanized infantry company that would be fighting from the beaches of Normandy all the way to Germany. I'd had exactly 4 hours of training on the weapon, just enough to learn the basics of loading, firing, and clearing jams. Everything else I'd have to learn on the job, in combat, while people were trying to kill me. The Army's training philosophy was simple and brutal. The ones who learned fast survived. The ones who didn't became casualties that needed to be replaced. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun is a legend, a weapon so effective and reliable that it's still in service today, nearly a century after John Browning designed it. It fires a half-inch diameter bullet at nearly 3,000 feet per second, can punch through engine blocks and light armor, has an effective range of over a mile, and a rate of fire of around 550 rounds per minute. When Ma Deuce speaks, everything and everyone in front of her dies or takes cover. She's mounted on everything from half-tracks to tanks to aircraft, used by every branch of the service, trusted by every soldier who's ever been behind her. But she's also heavy, requires constant maintenance, is prone to overheating if you fire too long, and demands absolute respect because she'll kill you as quick as she'll kill the enemy if you don't handle her properly. And in June 1944, as a 20-year-old kid who'd barely qualified with a rifle, I was given responsibility for this beast of a weapon and told to figure it out before we hit the beach. I met Charlie 7 and her crew 2 days before we loaded onto the LST that would take us to France. The half-track was a M3, an armored vehicle with tracks in the back and wheels in the front, open-topped, carrying a squad of infantry plus crew. My position was standing in the ring mount behind the cab, where the Ma Deuce was mounted on a pedestal that allowed 360-degree traverse. The driver was a farm kid from Iowa named Pete Wilson, quiet and competent. The track commander was Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a Polish guy from Chicago who'd been with the division since North Africa and who'd seen more combat than the rest of us combined. The infantry squad we carried was led by Corporal Danny Martinez from Texas, 8 riflemen who'd ride in the back of the track and dismount to fight when necessary. These men would be my family for the next 11 months, and their lives would depend on my ability to master Ma Deuce. Kowalski took me aside that first day and gave me the speech that probably saved my life, and definitely shaped how I understood my job. Caruso, you're now the most important man on this track. That 50 cal is our primary weapon, our best defense against enemy armor and infantry. When shit gets real, everyone's going to be depending on you to keep that gun running. So you're going to learn everything about that weapon. You're going to treat it like it's your wife or your mother or your god, and you're going to be ready to use it when we need it. You understand? I nodded, scared out of my mind, but trying not to show it. Good. Now let me teach you what the Army didn't have time to cover. For 2 days, Kowalski drilled me on the M2. We broke it down and reassembled it until I could do it blindfolded. We practiced loading the belt-fed ammunition, practiced traversing and elevating, practiced immediate action drills for the most common malfunctions. He showed me how to estimate range and lead moving targets, how to fire in short bursts to avoid overheating the barrel, how to adjust my aim based on tracer rounds, how to conserve ammunition because we'd never have as much as we needed. He made me recite the weapon's specifications until they were burned into my brain. Weight, 84 pounds, length, 65 inches, effective range, 1,800 meters, cyclic rate, 550 rounds per minute, muzzle velocity, 2910 feet per second. Numbers that would become as familiar as my own name. But more than the technical training, Kowalski taught me the philosophy of being a machine gunner. This weapon is your responsibility, Caruso. She's alive in a way, has a personality, has moods. Treat her right and she'll save your life. Neglect her and she'll jam when you need her most, and you and everyone else will die. You're married to Ma Deuce now, for better or worse, till death do you part. Learn to love her, because your life depends on her loving you back. At the time, I thought he was being melodramatic, anthropomorphizing a weapon, trying to psych me up. But he was right, more right than I could have understood before experiencing combat. That weapon did become alive to me, did develop a personality, and I did love her and hate her and depend on her in ways that defined my entire war experience. We hit Omaha Beach on June 8th, driving our half-track off an LST into chest-deep water, struggling through the surf onto sand still covered with the wreckage and bodies from D-Day. My first view of war was the aftermath of the beach assault. Destroyed equipment everywhere, graves registration teams collecting bodies, wounded men being evacuated, and the constant sound of artillery and small arms fire from inland where the fighting continued. I stood in my ring mount behind Ma Deuce, hands on the grips, scanning for targets, terrified that I'd see Germans and have to fire, terrified that I'd freeze up or miss or get my friends killed through my incompetence. But the beach was secure, and we drove inland without making contact, following roads that had been cleared by the units that landed before us. My first time firing Ma Deuce in combat came on June 10th, in the hedgerow country south of the beach. We were part of a column moving to reinforce the line when German infantry ambushed us from a hedgerow to our right. Machine gun fire raked the column, and I heard the distinctive crack of bullets passing close. Kowalski was yelling at me, "Traverse right, 50 meters, base of the hedgerow, fire, fire!" My hands moved automatically, swinging the gun toward the target, thumbs finding the butterfly trigger, pressing down. Ma Deuce roared to life, the sound overwhelming, the recoil pushing back against my shoulders, the weapon bucking and vibrating with controlled violence. I saw tracers arc out toward the hedgerow, saw them disappear into the vegetation, saw dirt and branches explode where the heavy rounds hit. I fired in bursts like Kowalski had taught me, 4 or 5 seconds, then release, traverse slightly, fire again. The German machine gun went silent, and I didn't know if I'd killed them or just suppressed them enough to make them take cover. The engagement lasted maybe 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it was over, when the column started moving again, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the grips. I'd just fired a weapon in combat for the first time, had maybe killed men, and I felt sick and exhilarated and terrified all at once. Kowalski climbed up beside me and clapped me on the shoulder. "Good shooting, Caruso. You kept your head, put fire where it needed to be, probably saved some lives in the trucks behind us. How do you feel?" I didn't know how to answer that, didn't know how to articulate the chaos of emotions. So I just said, "I feel like I need to throw up." He laughed. "That's normal. First time's always rough. But you did good, kid. Ma Deuce performed, and so did you. That's all that matters." Over the following weeks, I fired Ma Deuce dozens of times, in ambushes and firefights and defensive positions. I learned to read the battlefield, to identify threats, to prioritize targets. German infantry got the standard treatment. Short bursts aimed at the largest concentration. German machine gun nests got sustained fire to suppress them while our infantry maneuvered. German trucks and light vehicles got raked with fire that punctured engines and tires and bodies, And German armor, the panzers and assault guns that terrified our infantry, got special attention. The 50 cal couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of most German tanks, but it could damage optics and periscopes, could suppress infantry supporting the tanks, could in rare cases penetrate the thinner side and rear armor. Kowalski taught me to aim for the weak spots, to look for opportunities, to understand that even if I couldn't kill a tank, I could make it harder for that tank to kill us. I learned Ma Deuce's personality during those weeks. She was temperamental when dirty, prone to jamming if I didn't keep her clean and lubricated. She overheated if I fired too long without pause, the barrel glowing red and the weapon refusing to chamber new rounds until she cooled down. She was ammunition hungry, could burn through a 100-round belt in 11 seconds of sustained fire, which meant I was always worried about running out. But when she was properly maintained, when I treated her with the respect she demanded, she was absolutely reliable. She never failed me when I needed her most, never jammed in the middle of a firefight, never let me down. And that reliability bred trust, bred affection, bred the kind of bond that Kowalski had talked about. I started talking to Ma Deuce, carrying on one-sided conversations while I cleaned her or loaded ammunition, or just stood watching the ring mount during the long hours when nothing was happening. I'd thank her after successful engagements, apologize when I let her get too dirty, promise to take better care of her. The other guys in the squad thought I was crazy, made jokes about Caruso and his girlfriend, but they didn't understand. Ma Deuce was the thing standing between me and death, was the tool that allowed me to protect my friends, was the constant in a world of chaos and uncertainty. Of course I talked to her. Of course I treated her like she was alive. In every way that mattered, she was. By July, we'd pushed out of the hedgerow country and were part of Operation Cobra, the breakout that finally cracked the German defenses and allowed us to race across France. The 2nd Armored Division was in its element, mobile warfare, fast-moving columns that bypassed resistance and drove deep into German-held territory. My days became a blur of movement and combat, standing in the ring mount for hours as we drove, scanning for threats, engaging targets when they appeared, then moving again. The pace was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating in a terrible way. We were winning, pushing the Germans back, liberating French towns to cheering crowds who threw flowers and offered wine. But the cost was constant. Vehicles getting hit by Panzerfausts or mines, men dying in ambushes, casualties that were quickly replaced by green troops who didn't survive their first engagement. In August, we fought through the Falaise Gap, trying to trap the remnants of the German 7th Army before they could escape east. The fighting was intense, Germans trying desperately to break out while we tried to close the trap. I fired Ma Deuce until the barrel was glowing red, until the weapon was so hot I couldn't touch it without gloves, until I'd gone through every round of ammunition in the track and was begging for resupply over the radio. We stopped German infantry advances, shot up trucks trying to escape, engaged tanks at ranges that were suicidal for a 50 cal but necessary because we were the only thing between them and a breakthrough. The killing was industrial in scale, impersonal, mechanical. Point, fire, watch men fall, traverse to new target, fire again. I stopped thinking of them as people, started thinking of them as targets, problems to be solved with the application of Ma Deuce's steel voice. That's when I started having the dreams. Every night when I could sleep, which wasn't often, I'd dream about the men I'd killed. I'd see their faces, magnified through the gun's sight, see the impact of the 50 cal rounds hitting their bodies, see them fall and not get up. In the dreams, they'd stand back up and walk toward me, and I'd fire Ma Deuce, but the rounds would pass through them without effect and they'd keep coming until they reached the track and pulled me down into darkness. I'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, reaching for Ma Deuce's grips to reassure myself she was still there, still real, still capable of protecting me. The other men in the squad had their own nightmares. We all did, but we didn't talk about them. We just functioned during the day and endured the nights and kept moving forward because there was no alternative. By September, we'd crossed into Belgium, then into Germany itself. The fighting changed character, became more desperate as we pushed into German homeland territory where every soldier knew they were fighting for their homes and families. The Germans fought harder, defended more stubbornly, counterattacked more frequently, and I fired Ma Deuce more than ever. sometimes going through 1,000 rounds in a single engagement, the weapon overheating repeatedly, my shoulders bruised from the constant recoil, my hands blistered from handling hot metal, my ears ringing despite the earplugs we were supposed to wear but rarely did because we needed to hear commands. In October, during a particularly vicious firefight outside Aachen, something happened that crystallized my relationship with Ma Deuce. We were in a defensive position, our half-track hull down behind a berm, when a German counterattack hit us with infantry and armor. I was engaging the infantry, firing controlled bursts, when a Panzer IV tank emerged from the smoke about 300 meters away. Its main gun traversed toward our position, and I knew that when it fired, the high-explosive round would destroy the half-track and kill everyone in it. I had seconds to act, and my training took over. I traversed Ma Deuce toward the tank, elevated to aim at the commander's cupola, and fired a sustained burst, probably 30 rounds. I saw tracers bounce off the turret armor, saw sparks, and then I saw the cupola hatch pop open and a figure slump. The tank slewed to the side, the main gun traversing away from us, and it stopped moving. I'd killed the tank commander, and without him, the crew had either abandoned the tank or were unable to fight it effectively. Kowalski was beside me staring at the stopped tank. "Jesus Christ, Caruso, did you just kill a tank with a 50 cal?" I was shaking, the adrenaline dump making me almost unable to stand. I killed the commander. The tank's still alive, it could start moving again any second. But it didn't move, and eventually our own tanks came up and dealt with it. The story spread through the company. Caruso killing a tank with Ma Deuce, embellished with each telling until it became legend. I became known as the best 50 cal gunner in the battalion, the guy who could kill anything with Ma Deuce, the soldier who'd developed an almost supernatural connection with his weapon. The reputation brought respect, but it also brought pressure. Now every time we went into combat, people expected miracles from me and Ma Deuce, expected us to solve problems that should have required heavier weapons, expected perfection every time I pulled the trigger. The weight of that expectation was crushing. I started to feel like I wasn't Vincent Caruso anymore, wasn't a person separate from the weapon. I was just Ma Deuce's operator, an extension of the machine, valued only for my ability to point and shoot. When we'd get hit and men would die, I'd hear whispers asking why I hadn't fired sooner, why I hadn't killed that particular German, why Ma Deuce hadn't saved us. And when we'd win an engagement largely because of my fire support, the praise felt hollow, because I knew it wasn't really me, it was the weapon, the 84 pounds of steel and springs that did the actual work while I just hung on and tried to aim. The relationship with Ma Deuce became increasingly complicated. I relied on her, loved her reliability, appreciated the protection she provided, but I also resented her, resented the killing she demanded of me, resented the way she'd consumed my identity until I was just the 50 cal gunner, instead of a person with thoughts and feelings and a life beyond the war. I maintained her religiously, cleaned her every day, checked every component, replaced worn parts before they could fail, but part of me wished she'd break, wished she'd jam irreparably, wished some circumstance would require me to give her up and become something other than her operator. The weapon had become both my salvation and my prison, and I didn't know how to reconcile those contradictions. In December, we fought in the Battle of the Bulge, thrown into the desperate defense against the German winter offensive. The fighting was brutal, in freezing temperatures that made the weapon harder to operate, that made the metal painful to touch with bare hands, that caused the oil to thicken and the action to slow. I learned to operate Ma Deuce with gloves, learned to manage the cold, learned to keep firing even when ice formed on the barrel and my hands were numb and I couldn't feel my feet. The battle lasted weeks, our half-track constantly on the move, responding to German breakthroughs, reinforcing threatened positions, counterattacking when possible. I fired Ma Deuce thousands of times during those weeks, went through so much ammunition that supply couldn't keep up, had to ration my bursts even when unlimited fire was needed. One night in late December, during a brief lull in the fighting, I was alone with Ma Deuce in the ring mount while the rest of the crew slept in the track below. It was snowing, gentle flakes accumulating on the weapon and on my helmet and shoulders. I was supposed to be on watch, scanning for threats, but instead I found myself staring at the weapon, running my gloved hands over the cold steel, thinking about the hundreds of men who died because I'd pulled the trigger. I'd become efficient at killing, had developed the skills to do it well, and that efficiency horrified me. I thought about the person I'd been before the war, the kid from the Bronx who'd never hurt anyone, who'd been squeamish about killing insects. That person was gone, replaced by someone who could cut men down without hesitation, who could watch them die and immediately traverse to the next target, who'd become as mechanical and unfeeling as the weapon he operated. I started crying, silent tears that froze on my face, mourning the loss of my innocence, mourning the person I'd been and could never be again. Ma Deuce sat there, cold and inert, waiting to be used again, waiting to kill again, patient and reliable and utterly indifferent to my crisis. The weapon didn't care about my guilt or my trauma or my moral struggles. It was just a tool, a machine designed for a purpose, and it fulfilled that purpose with perfect efficiency whenever I pulled the trigger. The moral burden was mine alone. Ma Deuce would never feel guilt or remorse or shame. Only I could feel those things, and I felt them crushing me under a weight I didn't know how to carry. Kowalski found me there, saw me crying, climbed up into the ring mount without a word. He stood beside me for a few minutes, then said quietly, "It gets to everyone eventually. The killing, the responsibility, the weight of it all. You think you're alone in this, but you're not. Every man who's fought in this war carries the same burden." I tried to explain that it was different for me, that as the 50 cal gunner I'd killed more men than most riflemen, that the industrial scale of the killing was destroying me. But Kowalski shook his head. "The number doesn't matter, Caruso. 1 or 100, it's the same burden. You did what you had to do, what the situation required, what would keep you and your brothers alive. Don't let it destroy you. Don't let the war take more from you than it already has." His words helped, some, but they didn't solve the fundamental problem. I was good at something I hated, was valued for a skill I wished I didn't have, was defined by my relationship with a weapon I both loved and resented, and I had no choice but to keep going, to keep pulling the trigger, to keep being Ma Deuce's operator until the war ended, or I was killed or wounded badly enough to be evacuated. There was no way out except through, and the only path through was to keep functioning, keep fighting, keep adding to the tally of men I'd killed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. We were in Czechoslovakia when the news came through, and the reaction was muted. Relief, certainly, but also confusion about what came next, what we were supposed to do now that killing was no longer our primary job. I stood in my ring mount, hands on Ma Deuce's grips, and felt empty. The weapon that had defined my life for 11 months was suddenly obsolete, unnecessary, a relic of a war that was over. I should have been happy, should have been celebrating like some of the other men, but all I felt was a strange sense of loss, like I was losing a part of myself, like Ma Deuce and I were being separated after a long partnership. They took Ma Deuce away from me in June when we were preparing to redeploy. The division was going to be reorganized, the equipment turned in or sent to the Pacific, the men either sent home or assigned to occupation duty. A supply sergeant came to collect the 50 cal, and I had to remove it from the ring mount and hand it over. I'd cleaned it one last time, oiled every surface, checked every component, made sure it was in perfect condition. The supply sergeant barely looked at it, just recorded the serial number and loaded it onto a truck with dozens of other weapons. Ma Deuce, the weapon that had saved my life countless times, that I'd talked to and relied on and built my entire combat identity around, was just inventory now. Just another piece of equipment to be stored or redistributed or scrapped. I went home in July 1945, took a train from New York to the Bronx, walked up the familiar streets to my parents' apartment. My family welcomed me home, threw a party, invited all the neighbors, celebrated the returning hero. But I wasn't a hero, I was just a machine gunner who'd survived while better men hadn't. I couldn't talk about the war, couldn't explain what I'd done or what it had cost me. How could I tell my mother that her son had killed hundreds of men? How could I explain to my father that I'd become intimate with a weapon, that I'd loved a machine more than I'd loved anything except survival? How could I make anyone understand what it meant to operate Ma Deuce, to be responsible for that kind of killing power, to carry the weight of every trigger pull? I struggled to adjust to civilian life. I worked a series of jobs, couldn't hold any of them for long. Couldn't focus on tasks that seemed meaningless compared to the life and death stakes of combat. I had nightmares every night, would wake up reaching for grips that weren't there, would hear Ma Deuce's distinctive sound in my head, would see the faces of men I'd killed. I started drinking to quiet the memories, to make the nightmares less frequent, to numb the guilt that never went away. My family didn't understand what was wrong with me, suggested I just needed to forget about the war and move on. But forgetting was impossible. Ma Deuce and the 11 months I'd spent behind her had marked me permanently, had changed me in ways that couldn't be undone. I met other veterans at the VFW, men who'd fought in different units, different theaters, different roles. Some of them understood what I was going through, shared similar struggles with readjustment and trauma and guilt. I met one veteran who'd been a B-17 bombardier, who'd dropped high explosives on German cities, who struggled with the knowledge that he'd killed thousands of civilians along with military targets. His burden was different from mine, but the weight was similar, and we found comfort in shared understanding. We did what we had to do, he'd tell me during our late-night conversations over beer. We can't change it, can't undo it, can only live with it and try to be better people now. The war's over, Caruso. We survived. Now we have to figure out how to live with being survivors. I eventually got stable, found work as a machinist, a job that utilized my understanding of mechanical systems, that let me work with my hands without requiring me to kill anyone. I married a wonderful woman named Angela in 1949, had 3 children, built a normal life. But Ma Deuce never left me, remained a presence in my thoughts, a reference point for understanding my own capabilities and limits. When I'd face challenges in civilian life, I'd think about standing in that ring mount, managing that weapon under impossible conditions. And I'd tell myself that if I could do that, I could handle whatever ordinary problem I was facing. The war had broken me, but it had also shown me I was capable of more than I'd believed possible. I went back to Europe in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. I visited the beaches, walked the hedgerow country, saw the peaceful farmland that had been a battlefield. And I went to a military museum in Belgium where they had a collection of World War II weapons, including an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun on a ring mount. I stood there looking at it for a long time, remembering, running my hand over the cold steel, checking the mechanisms by reflex. A museum guard approached and asked if I'd served, and I said yes. I'd been a 50 cal gunner. He offered to let me get behind the weapon, to stand in position like I had during the war, and I accepted. Standing behind that Ma Deuce, hands on the grips, sighting down the barrel, I felt a rush of emotion I hadn't expected. Nostalgia, grief, pride, shame, all mixed together in a way I couldn't untangle. This weapon, or one exactly like it, had been my constant companion for 11 months of combat. It had saved my life, had allowed me to save others, had made me a killer and a survivor and something in between. I'd loved it and hated it, had relied on it and resented it, had built my identity around it and spent decades trying to separate who I was from what it had made me do. The museum guard asked if I wanted to tell him my story, and I did, standing there behind the weapon, recounting some of the engagements, some of the close calls, some of the moments when Ma Deuce's reliability had meant the difference between life and death. He listened respectfully, asked intelligent questions, thanked me for my service. And when I was done, when I stepped away from the weapon for what I knew would be the last time, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Ma Deuce and I were finally, truly separated. She was a museum piece now, and I was an old man with memories. Our partnership was over, had been over for 50 years, but standing there had given me the chance to say goodbye, to acknowledge what we'd been to each other, to finally let go. I'm 98 years old now, one of the last surviving veterans of the European campaign. When people ask me about the war, about my experiences, I tell them about Ma Deuce, about the M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine gun that became my whole world for 11 months. I tell them about learning to operate her, about the bond that developed, about the killing she demanded and the protection she provided. I tell them about the weight of being responsible for that much firepower, about the moral burden of efficient killing, about living with the consequences of every trigger pull, and I tell them that mastering the weapon was easy. The Army could train anyone with basic intelligence to operate an M2, to maintain it, to fire it accurately. The mechanical skills weren't particularly difficult. What was hard, what remains hard even 80 years later, was living with what the weapon made me do, with the person I became behind those grips, with the knowledge that I was very good at something terrible. Ma Deuce never judged me, never questioned my decisions, never felt guilt or remorse. She was just a tool, perfect at her purpose, indifferent to the moral implications. But I wasn't a tool, I was a human being. And human beings aren't designed to kill on an industrial scale without consequences. The steel voice of the battlefield, we called her. Ma Deuce, speaking her message of death to anyone who stood in front of her. And I was the one who decided when she spoke, what she said, who received her message. That responsibility, that power, that burden, shaped everything I became. I mastered Ma Deuce, learned to operate her with skill and efficiency that saved lives and took lives in equal measure. But the real challenge, the real fight, was learning to live with being her master, learning to carry the weight of all those trigger pulls, learning to be Vincent Caruso again instead of just the 50 cal gunner. That fight never truly ended. I'm still fighting it, still trying to reconcile the person I was with the person I became, still trying to understand what it means to have been intimate with a weapon designed solely to destroy. Ma Deuce was my shield and my burden, my salvation and my curse, the thing I trusted most and the source of my deepest shame. That's the complexity of being a machine gunner in war, the contradiction that defines the experience and echoes through the rest of your life. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you understand the complex relationship between soldiers and their weapons, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember that weapons are tools, but the men who operate them are human beings who carry the weight of what those tools do. Remember that mastery and trauma often go hand in hand, that being good at something doesn't mean you're at peace with it. Thank you for listening to this old gunner's story about Ma Deuce, the steel voice that spoke for me during the war, and whose echoes I still hear today.